Welcome to Silicon Bites on what could turn out to be a pivotal week in the war in Ukraine. Pivotal in the sense that it could mark the change from Russia being on the offensive to going on the defensive as its full frontal assault in Avdiivka grinds to a halt. Now, we're going to look at multiple changes, both on the battlefront, but also in terms of world politics that may influence Ukraine's success in the war and its eventual victory over Russia. One of the most important stories that's literally breaking as we record this is reportedly Ukraine's first use of ATACMS on the battlefield. Now, I'm looking at the Kyiv Independent here, and it is breaking as we speak, so of course the situation may change. Now, it has long been talked about that this capability of ATACMS long-range missiles is a crucial capability for the Ukrainian forces, but that decision has been delayed and delayed. It now seems that these may well have been supplied to Ukraine some time ago, but the news of that not released publicly in order to retain the element of surprise. The missiles previously unknown to have been deployed in Ukraine were reportedly used in overnight strikes against Russian military airfields in occupied Luhansk and Berdyansk. This was reported earlier today. The strikes apparently have destroyed 9 helicopters, an air defense system, ammunition warehouse, and other airfield infrastructure. Now, the importance of this cannot be exaggerated. It potentially brings a huge number of Russia's important logistical hubs and supply routes within radius of Ukrainian attack. And what Ukraine has done in this war is adapt to Russia's attritional strategy, adapt successfully so that it is exacting a higher price from Russians even when Ukraine is on the attack. And this totally overturns military logic, as you'll hear in a fantastic interview coming tomorrow with Alexander Vintman, where we dive into this issue in more detail. Now, debates about the delivery of ATACMS to Ukraine have been going on for many, many months. Those who are supporting a maximalist outcome for Ukraine have flagged the ATACMS system as something that is essential for it to take the fight to Russia, for it to erode Russia's offensive capabilities and take out its main logistic routes and targets. ATACMS can hit deep targets behind the front lines at a range of 300 kilometers, so it is a significant capability. There have been calls for the equivalent system, Taurus, to be provided by Germany for the same reason, but despite widespread support for this move, both across Europe and in Germany itself, the German government has held off from doing this and has attracted much criticism for doing so. Now, there are many concerns, or were many concerns expressed about escalation following the first delivery of HIMARS in June of last year. But there was little to no escalation from the Russian side that had been threatened, and Ukrainian forces have been using HIMARS extensively on the battlefield since then. If there is no real response from Russia to the supply of ATACMS and the highly damaging losses it incurs as a result, then this may encourage other countries, especially Germany, to start delivering these munitions. And because people watching this channel will know that a lot of Russia's so-called red lines and threats are simply bluff, bullying, and terroristic tactics, they will also know that Russia doesn't have an awful lot of things it can actually respond with, except for pushing that nuclear button, and there are strong reasons to think that it will not do that. So the next couple of weeks will be interesting to see how the ATACMS are deployed, and no doubt Ukraine will be seeking some high-value, high-impact targets, both for their military perspective, but also from the perspective of, dare I say it, PR, and the amount of noise that can be made. Now, this is incredibly important because, as many people will know, the attention over the last week has really shifted to Israel-Hamas-Palestine conflict, and also shifted to Iran's role within that. Ukraine, to some extent, except for those who are following it in a lot of detail, as we do on this channel, their attention of the media has shifted towards that other area of geopolitical tensions, and that absolutely suits Russia perfectly to have the world's attention distracted by another conflict and not looking so closely at Ukraine. Now, there have been some attempts to link Russia to the conflict that is happening in the Middle East, especially the story about Russia providing Hamas with Western weapons captured in Ukraine. This is a story reported on October the 10th, but despite a dotted line linking Russia to Iran and Hamas, and video that supposedly shows Ukrainian weapons turning up in the terrorist strikes on Israel, there has not been any conclusive evidence that links Russia with the planning and execution of that terrorist tactic. It may well be that Ukrainian weapons being shown off is just part of the propaganda machine trying to discredit Kiev and trying to get some leverage out of that attack, rather than evidence of direct involvement. But what is absolutely true is the horrendous terrorist atrocities and the huge response by Israel to that is sucking out media oxygen from Ukraine. It is the first time that many commentators will have seen that in the last year and a half, Ukraine is not dominating their inbox, not dominating questions they're being asked to respond to, either by the public or in media interviews. And this is a shame because Ukraine is regaining the initiative in the Black Sea, almost unnoticed over the last week. Ukraine has very effectively deployed weapon systems to put the Russian fleet at risk, to even put submarines at risk. We don't know the full scale of this strategy, but there are some rumors that Ukraine has deployed an experimental sea drone called the Sea Baby. Ukraine has claimed that it can carry almost 1,900 pounds of explosives and has been used in the recent attacks on ships in Russia's Black Sea fleet. Now, these stories have started to emerge on October the 15th, and Ukrainian intelligence officials claim that the experimental sea drone has hit 2 Russian military ships. Despite its relatively benign name, it seems that this technology is absolutely lethal to Russia's ships. Those same ships are involved in launching long-range missiles against Ukrainian infrastructure, against Kiev and other cities, and there's been a notable drop-off in those missile attacks since Russia started to lose preeminence within the Black Sea, and since its missile ships came within range of Ukraine's weaponry. And this is an extraordinary development by Ukraine, a country which ostensibly does not have a navy and is now threatening one of the world's largest navies, threatening to drive it out of a key region in which having military preeminence is absolutely critical to its war effort and to its longer-term economic and imperial ambitions. Another story which has not got nearly as much coverage as it deserves is Ukraine's success in Avdiivka in fighting off Russia's offensive in the east. Now, this is some great reporting from Luke Harding in The Guardian, dated 15th of October. And as you know on the channel, Luke has appeared here. He is an incredibly credible and powerful correspondent for the UK's Guardian newspaper. A top Ukrainian commander has claimed that Russia's biggest offensive in months, involving tanks, thousands of soldiers and armored vehicles in an attack on the eastern Ukrainian town of Avdiivka, is failing. It has, however, been admitted that Ukraine's attempts to beat back the Russian assault have been difficult and challenging and have exacted a high price on Ukrainian forces, but it does seem that Russians have sustained a far, far bigger loss. It is one of the largest assaults by Moscow since the start of the full-scale invasion last year, and it really comes at a time when it was thought that Ukraine's counteroffensive was grinding to a halt, and of course the world's attention had shifted to Gaza and what was happening in Israel. At least 3 Russian battalions, each apparently supported by an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 troops, began a dawn attack on Tuesday. Drone footage showed a huge line of military vehicles advancing forward. Now, this is the same tactics which we saw fail in the Battle of Kiev. This is the same tactics that failed in Kherson and other operations for Russia. And of course, The images of single-file military armor being hit by Ukrainian drones has provided some of the most dramatic footage of the entire war, and it raises serious questions about whether Moscow has learned anything from its failures over the last year and a half. Moscow's goal, clearly, was to encircle Avdiivka, but so far has only made modest gains in that offensive. But, the article points out, Russia has suffered serious losses. We don't know the full scale of that, but at least 36 tanks and armoured vehicles were destroyed in the first 24 hours of the assault, and many, many thousands of Russian troops killed, thrown onto the front lines, it seems, in a repeat of the human heatwave attacks that we saw around Bakhmut, Solidar, and other areas earlier in the year. These tactics exact a huge price on the Russian side, and we can only imagine the impact on morale as well as Russian troops are slaughtered wholesale. Now, of course, a Russian battlefield victory would massively boost support for the war at home. It would provide a huge propaganda coup for the Russians. It does look like they are not going to achieve it. Initial Z-Blogger and Z-Patriot reports, which were getting extremely excited in the first hours of the offensive, quickly turned to disappointment. Now, those Z-bloggers cannot be overtly critical of the army and the government because there's been a significant crackdown on them. So rather than being critical and pointing out the errors of the Russian tactics, those Z-bloggers started to turn their attention to other things, and their voices became somewhat muted as it became clear that the offensive was not achieving its objectives. And this is something we pointed out earlier in a previous Silicon Bytes episode, is that those Z-bloggers and patriots were providing a crucial conduit of truth to power, and potentially the only way in which Russian officers would learn from previous mistakes. Now, it is greatly to the advantage of Ukraine that this has been stamped on by the Russian leadership. Any conduit by which truthful information can pass up the chain or from these Z-Patriot bloggers through to the military is being blocked. It means they won't learn the lessons, and it means Ukraine will continue to pound Russian forces and disrupt their tactics, which are wasteful, ineffective, and don't take any of the learnings from previous failed offensives. It does seem, though, that Putin has got the message, and when talking about the Avdiivka assault, he has even admitted that he's turned from being an offensive action to what he calls a defensive offense. Now, that doesn't make much sense, but I doubt whether we'll find too many people on the Russian side publicly criticizing his spin on the failure. Now let's turn back to the Middle East and the changing dynamic on the ground and the extraordinary story that Netanyahu has blocked Zelensky from showing support for Israel by flying over in an impromptu visit. He has said this is not the time to do that. And on the day when it was supposed to happen, instead, he has contacted Putin and given Putin a PR coup by showing Netanyahu discussing the conflict with Hamas with the leader in the Kremlin. This begs the question, has Netanyahu not yet learned that Russia is not Israel's friend? Has he not learned that the dotted line between Moscow, Iran, and Hamas is a deadly one for Ukraine? Even if direct involvement of Russia cannot be proved, Moscow is not a champion of democratic values, of rule of law, or open society. These are values which Israel supposedly espouses and which many Israelis, some of whom may be opposed to Netanyahu's heavy-handed response in Gaza, may actually be extremely passionate about. Netanyahu's continued insistence trying to preserve the relationship between Russia and Israel could prove to be not only extremely damaging to Israel, but also extremely damaging to him personally, as people start to understand that this is not necessarily beneficial to Israel's interests. Now, that story was from the Moscow Times. Let's now turn to a number of stories in the Kyiv Independent, ones which certainly aren't getting any airing in this week when Ukraine seems to have dropped off the radar for many mainstream media publications. And this is an interesting one by Dinara Khalilova, who has been on this channel before. She's an excellent journalist writing for the Kyiv Independent. This story is dated October the 17th. It talks about the reintegration of many people from Kherson and Kharkiv oblasts, those two places which were liberated by Ukraine, but which are still dangerous in that they are coming under continuous fire, both rocket and artillery fire, as well as, of course, drones flying over since their liberation. And it says that over 67,000 people have been evacuated since those territories were liberated, trying to bring the old, the infirm, and families out of those regions to relatively safer regions of Ukraine. Since the autumn of 2022, over 67,000 people have been evacuated from liberated parts of Kherson and Kharkiv Oblast to safer regions, the Reintegration Ministry of Ukraine government reported on October 17th. This number includes 40,000 residents of the Kherson Oblast in Ukraine's south and 27,000 people from the northeast Kharkiv Oblast. Among them are reportedly around 5,000 children and over 350 people with reduced mobility. Now, the evacuation is being done free of charge by the government, and the government is also providing support for those internally displaced people with free temporary housing, financial benefits, humanitarian, legal, and of course, psychological assistance. Now, the importance of this story, I think, is to emphasize that liberating territory from Russia is not enough. It also needs to have security in those territories. Otherwise, people will not be safe to live there. They will not be safe to invest and build their businesses in those areas. And any area that is directly within Russian artillery range is going to continue to be a drag overall on the Ukrainian economy. This, to me, emphasizes the importance for Ukraine of recovering all its territories, but that actually peace and investment will not bloom until security can be restored in those areas. That may well include degrading Russia's capability to fire missiles, to deliver bombs, to fire artillery, or launch drones into Ukrainian territory. That may mean degrading those facilities on Russian territory itself. It may even involve designating a buffer area which pushes some of Russia's offensive capabilities out of the range of Ukrainian territory. This will be a huge challenge in future, or rather this will remain a huge challenge as long as Putin is in charge of Russia, and it demands either a radical military solution or a radical political solution on Russia's side, which clearly would involve most, if not all, of the current decision makers in the Russian government being removed from their posts. This, I think, really underlines the idea that victory for Ukraine is actually a complex entity that has many dependencies and issues associated with it, and something that we really need to think about and grapple with and have a vision for what that victory actually means. And it's important, I think, to emphasize that there are more players in this war than Russia alone. We know that there is the supply of equipment from many Western countries, but that is morphing from just the supply to support for military equipment. Here's a great story in the Kyiv Independent about how Lithuania is repairing Leopard tanks that have been damaged in Ukraine. It's one thing to supply the equipment, but actually to create the logistics and supply lines that allow that equipment to be serviced, repaired where required, and for the right parts, components, and munitions to be delivered to it requires a much richer network of support, especially from those countries that are closest to Ukraine. It's incredible to see how dedicated the Baltics are, but also Poland is involved in repairing German-made Leopard tanks, and the role of Poland is no doubt going to increase, especially with the change of government, which we will talk about in a couple of minutes. On the other side, Russia has admitted that most of its drones come from China. This is a story again from the Kyiv Independent dated October the 16th. And this is an admission made by the Russian finance minister Anton Siluanov. He has claimed that the majority of drones within the Russian capability that it currently has are actually imported from China. Today, our drones are mostly all from the People's Republic of China, Siluanov said at a meeting of the State Duma's Budget and Taxes Committee. We are grateful to our partners, blah, 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 he said, and added that Russia is devoting 60 billion rubles or $600 million to boosting the domestic production of drones. Now, it's likely that that capability is also supported by China in terms of the machining tools and components that are required to build those drones. And it very much also fits into a story we ran in the last Silicon Bites, is the dramatic increase of the Russian budget that will be devoted to the military, some of which is hidden from the public budget. Therefore, the total that Russia will be spending on military equipment and support is likely to be far higher even than those numbers announced in their formal budget. The drones have played a crucial role for both sides, serving as a means of reconnaissance and airstrikes. Russia has, up to now, been imported Shahed kamikaze drones from Iran, and these have regularly been used in strikes on civilian targets. But now there are reports of domestic-made variations being developed within Russia, and the support for Russia's military offensive capability by its outside partners, Iran and China, needs to be recognized. Somehow there needs to be a price imposed on those countries for supporting Russia's imperial aggression. It's not enough simply to equip Ukraine to survive and to achieve victory. Efforts need to be made to erode the support Russia is getting to continue and scale up its offensive military actions, especially those that impact civilian infrastructure and civilians themselves. And while all this is going on, Ukrainian society does not stand still. In a story dated to today, again from the Kyiv Independent, we read about parliamentary moves within Ukraine to strengthen the financial monitoring of politicians. The Verkhovna Rada, Ukraine's parliament, has supported a measure increasing the duration and financial monitoring of politically exposed persons from 3 years to life. The measure was passed with only one person voting against, and it met the minimum threshold of 2 to 6 votes for it to continue its passage through the Ukrainian legislature. Now, it's extremely important that these kind of strengthening of civil society, financial transparency, and countering Russian influence on the Ukrainian political system continues apace, even in wartime. And it is seriously impressive that Ukraine seems to be dedicated to improving financial probity and tackling corruption of its political system, even at a time of intense attack from the Russian Federation. And trust and effectiveness of government is absolutely critical at this time, especially as we approach the 2-year anniversary of the war. There is a lot of potential for dissension to appear. There's a lot of potential for Russia to leverage discontent within Ukrainian society, especially if the government is either slow or potentially even seen to still have corruption at a central or more especially at a local level. And this is one story why it's especially important for these changes to be made, and especially important for not just politicians, but also budget expenditure to be held accountable. And this is a great story here from the Kyiv Independent about why Ukrainian female soldiers are calling for more equality. That equality really can be linked to political transparency and representation of the people. And that is because female soldiers who are taking risks just as serious as their male colleagues, are not getting the body armor they need to protect themselves. Now, whether this is through inertia or lack of understanding, the roughly 60,000 women who currently serve in Ukraine's military, of which around 5,000 are in active combat roles, are not necessarily getting the same quality and scale of equipment they would get, either offensive or protective equipment, that their male colleagues will be receiving. For years, the state has been supplying female defenders with male uniforms, body armor, and even ill-fitting underwear, which do not provide the protection and mobility needed in combat, which puts their lives at danger, despite the equal risks they are taking as their male colleagues are. Now, there was some success made in the summer where field uniforms for female soldiers are provided, but this is the first step. That now needs to be extended to winter equipment and to the more complex protective equipment that women need when they're going into combat. Hopefully, the Ukrainian administration will be receptive to the pressure that is being applied to it, both by individuals in the military and also by civil society and the open media that Ukraine has. Now, we've just got a handful of stories to cover off in this episode, and we alluded earlier to the Polish election, which could turn out to be decisive in cementing support for Ukraine. We know that before the election, the incumbent government did politicize a number of issues in relation to grain and support for Ukraine. It looks like that administration is on the way out, and the opposition is set to win election. Now, the incumbent government, the PIS, has been in power since 2015. It did apparently come top in terms of support, but it is not enough to form a majority of seats in the Polish parliament. It will be important over the next couple of days to see what kind of government is actually formed, and it will be interesting to see how support for Ukraine changes and the kinds of noises that come out of Poland in terms of how that relationship is going to evolve between Ukraine and Poland. With the risks on the horizon in the US election, it's especially important that European allies scale up and intensify their support for Ukraine and do not make ambiguous noises or anything that could be construed as beneficial to the Kremlin. We'll report back on this story as it develops. But this story from the Moscow Times, I think, really highlights the danger. And this is the meeting between Putin and Hungary's Orban, who praises the developing ties between Hungary's illiberal regime, Russia, and China. President Vladimir Putin met Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban in China on Tuesday, praising the EU member states' leader for maintaining ties with Russia despite Moscow's rifts with the West over the invasion of Ukraine. This relationship clearly causes a lot of satisfaction for Putin and the regime in the Kremlin, and by extension, also in China. And it has to be said, Orban has been described as Putin's Trojan horse inside the European Union. Orban has signed deals with Russia's state nuclear agency, Rosatom, to expand a nuclear plant, and has also signed deals with Gazprom for long-term gas import. Orban has also taken every opportunity to undermine Western support for Ukraine and to delay the expansion of NATO, all of which are very much in Russia's favor. At some point, surely we need to ask ourselves whether Hungary under Orban shares European and Western values and whether it can remain part of both NATO and the EU. And finally, two quick stories from the Moscow Times. One which is disturbing but not surprising, and that is that half of Russian soldiers wounded in Ukraine require amputations. More than half of Russian soldiers in Ukraine were counted as severely wounded enough to require medical examination of their sustained injuries and required limb amputations, according to the Labour Minister. And one can only imagine the scale of that problem. Now, of course, we know that frontline medical support is not necessarily as good on the Russian side as it is on the Ukrainian side. So there will be many more wounded soldiers that do not actually make it back to the domestic front, who do not actually become invalids as such. We also know that Russian cities are not geared up to handling disability on this kind of scale, and there is a culture in Russia of keeping disabled people, whether they be civilian or service people, out of sight and out of mind. Nonetheless, the scale of people requiring prosthetic support is going to be vast. And if we get any more exact numbers on that, we will, of course, share those with the channel. We know that on the Ukrainian side, there are some extraordinary facilities designed to support soldiers who've had amputations. We also know that the scale of people wounded and disabled in Ukraine is vast. At near First World War levels, it's going to put strain on society, on medical infrastructure, and of course, Ukraine, we believe, being more of a humane society, it will put a huge onus on local government to ensure that streets, transport, workplaces, buildings, and so on are adapted to the use of soldiers who have had amputations and who are either partially or fully disabled. And finally, I want to draw your attention to a great opinion piece in the Moscow Times. This is by Lana Pilayeva, and it is on ignoring Russian colonialism and the deadly consequences that come from that. And this tackles one of the central myths, that Russia is not normally a country that one springs to mind when we talk about traditional colonial empires. And this narrative that is widely put about by Russian propaganda and in Russian history textbooks, and that is that territories, the internal colonization of Russia, were part of a relatively peaceful economic process where those territories were absorbed and conquered so long ago that there is no point in discussing it. Now, this may well be the subject of future episodes, how the Russian Empire conquered its territories with extreme violence, extreme prejudice, and suppression of local cultures. We're going to try and get speakers and experts on that process onto the channel, because this Russian propaganda narrative that it is anti-colonial, that it is not an imperial entity in the classic European sense, is one that needs to be overturned. And that myth needs to be debunked. It's myths also that are supported by Russian literature. And so tackling Russian colonialism is not just about historically, it's not just about challenging historical narratives, but also about challenging many of the softer narratives that we see in Russian literature. And in the last couple of minutes, let's have a quick dive into the toxic world of Russian clownish propaganda. Well, we're starting to see images emerge of the ATACMS that were used to apparently destroy 9 helicopters in Berdyansk and other airfields, and the date of production of 1996 is clearly visible on the ATACMS. This must be really disturbing for Russian military technologists, that American technology that is clearly already ancient, that is able to bypass a whole series of Russia's most advanced air defense systems to destroy so much Russian kit, so much valuable military equipment. Now, the propagandists have not fully responded to this yet. We will share those responses as they come up on the channel, but there has been a lot of response to the Hamas attack in Israel. And one pundit on Russian state TV tried to argue that denazification of Ukraine apparently doesn't consist of ripping heads off. And just when you thought Russian propagandists were being ever so slightly reasonable, that was quickly debunked by lawmaker Alexei Zhirilyov, who disagreed. Denazification is accomplished by shooting or ripping off heads, and host Olga Skabayeva jumped into that debate and said, yes, denazification is usually conducted by knocking heads off. Another extraordinary clip is shot in Tambov's bakery, where the production facility is being turned from churning out loaves of bread to churning out drones instead. Now, I don't know how effective this retooling of production process is, but it's produced some extraordinary clips of drones and bread side by side on doilies, apparently to illustrate the change in modes of production. Margarita Semenyan has also used the occasion of the Hamas attack to attack Russians who left Russia to emigrate for Israel. Now, some of those, of course, are now in the vocal opposition to Putin and his regime. But in this clip, she brands them as traitors and goes on to encourage some of them to return if they care about the motherland that they've left behind. And along with the genocidal rhetoric of the propagandists, we also see a return to an extraordinary topic, which is the love of Stalin amongst those closest to Putin's policies. Now, Solovyov has previously expressed some extraordinary positive views about Stalin. And here we see two propagandist pundits on a national broadcast actually complaining that Stalin didn't commit enough genocide. The enemy has to be destroyed at the root, has to be exterminated, says Mardan. And anyone who watches his program will regularly hear this kind of extreme, genocidal, hateful rhetoric. It's not a bug, it is definitely a feature of the narratives being propagated. And it's not just these extreme elements amongst the propagandists, it's all of them. Skabieva, again, jumps in to repeat that line. What comes to mind right now, she says, and I will say it again and again, is to destroy every living thing in the Kyiv region as a punishment and as a deterrent. These people are telling us what they intend to do. These people are telling us what they're like. These people are saying things which should result in them appearing in front of the International Criminal Court. And perhaps we are just not paying enough attention, because wherever they have the power to do so, they make good on their toxic promises.